Yes. You're all heartily welcome to today's seminar on politics versus the economy. And my name is Max Elger. I'm the president of the Research Institute of Industrial Economics. And today we're holding this seminar, and we're heartily very glad to see Professor Stephen Davis here, who's going to talk about his research together with colleagues about policy uncertainty and how that relates to economic outcomes and behavior of firms in particular. And we also have a very distinguished panel that I'm not going to present it. I leave the word to Mia Ullabas, who's going to take us through this seminar. So please, Mia.
Thank you very much for this, Magnus. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning.
Very quiet today. Warmly welcome to this discussion. It's such an interesting topic, actually. After an autumn of quite high uncertainty, a challenging situation with the refugees, the migration situation, we have a discussion about policy uncertainty and how it curbs economic growth. As Magnus said, we have a very distinguished panel and professor here. So we will have a discussion at the end of the seminar, the last 30-35 minutes, together with the panel, which is one representative from the government. We have Max Elger here, the State Secretary at the Ministry for Finance, Minister for Finance Magdalena Andersson. We also have the leading opposition party, the Economic Policy Spokesperson here, Ulf Kristersson, and Professor Jon Hassler. We will discuss together with these persons, but first, of course, we will welcome and introduce Professor Stephen Davis. Stephen Davis is Professor of International Business and Economics at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. He's also an economic advisor to the U.S. Congressional Budget Office. And his research is focusing on the relation between policy uncertainty and economic growth. He is the co-founder of the Economic Policy Uncertainty Index, which measures the economic uncertainty and what impact it has on growth, productivity, investment, and employment. And I also know that today he's going to present some new research for you related to migration situation. He has invented, together with colleagues, the Migration Fear and Policy Uncertainty Index. So we do have a lot to discuss here today, and you can see that when it's time for you to ask questions and make commentaries, you have microphones right in front of you. I think there's some kind of button also, which is good to use when you have the word. Please welcome up on stage Professor Stephen Davis.
Thanks very much, Mia. That's a kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be back in Stockholm again, to have such a distinguished panel who will give some thoughts on what I have to say. Magnus is a longtime friend and research collaborator, and it's great to be back here and see him again. You know, when Max saw the slide go up and saw politics versus the economy, kind of was taken aback again by that title. But at least in the United States, if you think about what's happened in the last few years with the debt ceiling crisis, the fiscal cliff, some of you may be familiar with those, there really was some politics versus the economy. And so maybe that reflects my American roots. And here's the question that I want to take up today. As Mia suggested, does policy uncertainty curb economic growth? This is not a hard question to motivate these days, sadly. I already referred to some of what's happened in the United States in the last several years, which is, at least in recent decades, quite extraordinary in terms of how much policy-related uncertainty there has been. Concerns that has spilled over in negative ways to the economy. In the Eurozone area, there's been a series of crises related to sovereign debt problems, particularly in Greece, financial crisis and concerns about those that have thrown a harsh spotlight on the institutional shortcomings of the Eurozone policy-making environment. creating a lot of uncertainty about what would be the consequences. Russia has entangled itself in a number of geopolitical conflicts, perhaps most notably in Ukraine. That's created a lot of uncertainty there. And then as Mia's alluded to, recently in much of Europe, there's been intense concerns about immigrants from North Africa and the Middle East and the difficulties that has created, but also the challenges and uncertainties confronting policymakers and citizens. What will policymakers do? What will be the consequences? So I think it's easy to motivate this question. What turns out from a researcher's perspective to be quite challenging is to take this concept of policy uncertainty, which we all have some sense, I think, that it might matter in an important way, but it's a bit of a squishy concept. The question is, how do we measure that in some systematic way that we can then use to make informed judgments about how policy uncertainty has moved over time, what are the sources of those movements, and then get on to the business of assessing its effects, and even the further business of thinking, well, are there things we might do to lessen the amount of policy uncertainty in the environment? And I'll talk a little bit about all of those, but I'll spend a lot of my time today just on the measurement issues and what comes out of that. What do we learn by just trying to measure policy uncertainty in a systematic way? I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about why policy uncertainty might harm the economy or how. Their economic theory, economic analysis throws up several reasons. But most of us, I think, have some intuitive sense that lots of uncertainty in the economic environment creates bigger challenges for businesses, for households, for policymakers themselves, and that some of that spills over to a negative way to the economy. So that's kind of backdrop to my discussion today, and there's lots of support for that backdrop in the economics literature. Here's an outline of what I'm going to talk about. I said before, I'll talk about first how we measure economic policy uncertainty, and that's an area where my co-authors and I have innovated a lot. And then we'll talk a little bit about how do we assess the methods we use. Okay? I'm going to look a little bit at I'm going to take those methods that I use to measure policy uncertainty and apply them to the immigration context in particular. And I'll show you how I construct a migration-related fear index and a migration-related policy uncertainty index. And then I'll summarize rather briefly the more technical work on trying to assess the economic effects of policy uncertainty. Okay? So, first, because this is a squishy concept, this idea of policy uncertainty, it's important to be very clear about at least what we try to measure. Okay? So this is what we're trying to do. We want to capture uncertainty about who will make policy decisions, like who's going to win the next election. Uncertainty about what policy actions will be taken. Okay? Say in response to immigration challenges in the current environment. And then uncertainty about the effects of policy actions, because there's often a lot of uncertainty about the consequences of policy actions and lots of disagreement about that as well. So that's what I'm trying to capture. Within that, I want to stress that regardless of whether the policy decisions are intrinsically economic or not, they might have important economic ramifications. So even national security decisions about which there's uncertainty can spill over in an important way to the economy. And I want to capture that too. Okay? So that's what I'm trying to capture. Now here's the basic idea of how we go about this for the United States. It's essentially computer automated readings of newspapers and then constructing frequency counts of the newspaper articles that talk about economics, policy matters, and uncertainty. Okay? So I'm going to have three criteria, and I'm going to write a computer program that identifies and counts all of the articles that meet these three criteria. They've got to talk about the economy. That's the E requirement up there. They've got to have one of those policy terms in them. And I'll tell you a little bit later how I chose those policy terms. There's a systematic approach there. And then they've got to talk about uncertainty. Okay, so E, P, and U. So for my main U.S. index, I'll take the 10 of the largest U.S. newspapers, and I will count the number of articles that meet these criteria. month by month. I'll go back to 1985, I'll eventually go back to 1900, I'll show you a little bit of that. And then I have to scale it some way, because newspapers are different size, they change in size over time, and so on. So I'll scale it by the number of articles in the same newspaper in the same month. And then I basically average those scaled frequency counts across newspapers. That's the basic idea that we apply repeatedly, not just to the United States, but about a dozen other countries. Okay, here's what comes out of that for the United States from 1985 to 2015. This is a plot of that index, and I've annotated several of the major movements here. So it's worth spending a couple of minutes on what's in this chart. First, you can see two basic patterns. There's a lot of fluctuations. And second, the period from 2008 to 2013 does stand out in the United States, both in terms of the number of large spikes, but also the average level. Now, let's look at some of the, I'm going to step over here, look at some of the individual spikes. And if you stare at these, there are a variety of different events that are driving policy uncertainty. So one type of event that shows up is a response to shocks that are completely outside the economic and the political system as it normally functions. So I think of 9/11 as an example. Okay, that's very much an unforeseen event, very much not business as usual. And that created a lot of uncertainty about, well, how are policymakers going to respond to that in the United States? What will be the effects? You can see a few other episodes like that. Maybe Gulf War I, Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait is another example. Then there are instances where it's clear that what happened is there's a big shock that's originating within the economic system. And that creates a lot of uncertainty about how policymakers will respond. And I think the clearest example of that was the failure of Lehman Brothers in September 2008 that really set off the most intense part of the global financial crisis. And there was a lot of uncertainty about how policymakers would respond, what they should do, and what the consequences would be. And then there's another category of events here where they are really, it's uncertainty that is originating within the policy-making system itself. And this is the politics part of the politics versus the economy. And sadly, we have several such events in recent years in the United States. There's, I don't know how much play it got in Sweden. I suspect it got a fair amount. Remember, the Democrats and Republicans were fighting over whether to extend the U.S. debt ceiling. And there was serious doubt as to whether the U.S. would make all of its, pay all of its obligations in a timely manner. There was even questions about whether the U.S. would meet its Treasury debt obligations in a timely manner. And that was a considerable source of uncertainty that was manufactured within the U.S. policy-making process itself. It wasn't something, it was a self-inflicted wound. Okay, so you see examples of all these types of things. So the fiscal cliff, the government shutdown episode are of the same character. You also see that close presidential elections, not surprisingly, are also associated with lots of policy uncertainty. So the picture that I want you to take away from this discussion of this chart is there's a variety of different types of events that can trigger policy uncertainty. Now, one thing you can do with these newspaper approaches is you can say, okay, in addition to having the computer identify all the articles that meet certain criteria, I can then take those set of articles and drill down deeper and say, well, what aspects of policy seems to be driving big movements in policy uncertainty as it's reported in newspapers. And in the U.S., the story in the kind of financial crisis and its aftermath, in that period, there's two big things that are going on. One is tax policy uncertainty, which is always a big deal in the United States. This is kind of a measure of the average level of tax policy uncertainty in the sample period in the U.S. You can see it's the biggest, but it's also the biggest increase from before the financial crisis to the financial crisis. The second biggest increase, the second biggest source of increase in the U.S. context during this period was uncertainty about healthcare policy. This was the period in which President Obama was pushing the Affordable Care Act, colloquially known as Obamacare. There was enormous disagreement between Democrats and Republicans about this. It eventually passed with no Republican support. There were constitutional challenges to the legislation after it was passed. There was uncertainty about its effects, and there were some serious implementation problems with it. So here is, if I take that approach and I say, in addition to requiring my E, P, and U criteria, I also have some other criteria, like it's got to have words like healthcare, hospital, health insurance, and that kind of thing. I can construct a health care policy uncertainty index, kind of a sub-index of the broader index. That's what I've got here. And you can see there are some notable episodes, but this is the period in which all of the battles over the Affordable Care Act were going on in the United States. So this approach you can kind of drill down and talk about different areas of policy uncertainty. I'm going to take that approach with immigration shortly. Now, we've done this for a dozen countries, including all the G10 economies. I'm just going to show you one other country, and I picked Russia both because it's interesting, it's a big country, and also because Russia's a challenging country to do this. It's not a state-run press, but it's a press that comes under a lot of pressure from the government. So we picked, after talking to people who are knowledgeable about Russia, this is a newspaper that's relatively free in the Russian setting, as I understand it. And it's also one that has a good digital archive that goes back some time. And you can see, maybe not too surprising, that there is a lot of uncertainty, policy-related uncertainty in Russia associated with military conflicts and other geopolitical concerns. So that's just an example of how we can do this for another country. We've also can push the indexes back very far in time, as long as we have access to digital archives that our computer program can read. So we pushed this back to 1900 in the United States, and we've done the same for the UK. It's basically, as long as you can get the digital archives, and you can do this. So that's pushing the US back. Now, you might be saying to yourself, as I did when first started working this, well, does this really work? How do we know we're measuring something that's informative about the level of policy uncertainty in the economy? That's a question that we've spent a lot of time trying to address. I'm going to give you a very quick tour of some of the things that tell us at least there's useful information in these indexes, even if they're not perfect. First point is just a market use test. Our measures have been picked up worldwide by financial institutions, by policy-making environments, central banks, IMF, and so on. Here's a list of some of them. It's also, BlackRock is probably the largest asset fund manager in the world. They basically saw our stuff, evaluated it, and they have their own in-house team now that does essentially something very similar. They won't tell me exactly what they're doing because they're a proprietary operation, but it's basically modeled after our work. And you can find these indexes that we construct on standard data sources that are streamed to business clients. So what this says is that there's some information value in these indexes above and beyond the other types of statistics. But the main thing we did to evaluate these indexes, and the thing that took a lot of time, is we had human beings who were trained, who read about 12,000 randomly selected newspaper articles, and then they would code them. Okay, so I had about 20 research assistants over a 2-year period that were working with me on this. And basically, after they go through a training process, they would be assigned articles, they would read them and then code them according to a certain criteria. Was this article really about economic uncertainty? Was it really about policy uncertainty? Okay? So then think about taking all of these randomly selected newspaper articles and treating the human being. Human beings are both better and worse than computers. Human beings can make judgments. Okay, they can see that the word tax, or the word tax appears in an article, but when you read the article, it has really nothing to do with tax policy. It has to do with, my mother-in-law is really taxing presents in my household. That's not really what we're trying to capture. Okay, so human beings can make those judgments, and then what we do is we say, okay, let's go back to that policy term set, and let's let the computer pick thousands of different possible term sets and find the term set that minimizes the errors against what the human does. Okay? Basically, you can think about the computers as making two kinds of errors. They flag an article as being about policy uncertainty when it's really not. That's a false positive. Or they fail to flag an article that really is about policy uncertainty, but a human being, the computer fails to catch it. The human being reads it and says, this is about policy uncertainty. So those are the false positives and false negatives. We choose that P term set to minimize that. That's how I got that policy term set. Okay? Now, once I've done that, I can then take that and evaluate the computer versus the human over time. Okay? And I'll just show you what, so here's on the sample of articles that my human beings read, basically my undergraduate students, or some undergraduate students at the University of Chicago. This is how they line up. The computer and the humans on the same set of articles. And it's by no means perfect, but it's pretty good. Okay, there seems to be something real there. So, that took a fair amount of work and a lot of research assistance, but, it was worthwhile. Now, there's some other results from the audit study. I'm going to skip over those. Another issue very quickly is political slant. Most newspapers kind of tend to lean right or left. That's certainly true in the United States. This is taking our 10 newspapers and dividing them up into Democratic-leaning, more left-of-center newspapers and Republican-leaning, right-of-center newspapers, and then constructing a right version of the policy uncertainty index and a left version. And they're pretty similar, which says to me that, yeah, political slant is in play, but it's not seriously distorting our index. I'll skip over this in the interest of time, but the basic idea is let's look at other text sources, not newspapers, but other text sources. And you can do that in a variety of ways, and they tell a broadly similar story. They don't go back as far in time, they're not produced every day, so you can't do quite as much with them, but they go back far in time. Now, what about immigration fears and policy uncertainty? Hasn't escaped our attention that that's a big issue these days, especially in Europe, but even in the United States. It's been a big issue in the presidential campaign that's underway. So we're going to take the same basic approach as I just described, but in addition to these E, P, and U criteria that I talked about, the economics, policy, and uncertainty criteria, I'm going to define two more term sets. A fear term set, okay, that I've labeled here, and a migration term set. And I'm going to construct the migration fear index by finding all of the articles that both talk about migration issues, okay, and have words that indicate fear, anxiety, or concern, that type of thing. That's my migration fear index. My migration policy uncertainty index is, it's got to meet all of the criteria for economic policy uncertainty that I talked about before, and it's got to be talking about migration. So it's just a direct analog to what I did for the healthcare policy uncertainty index. So we did this for, so far, France, Germany, UK, and US. I'll show you two countries here. Here's the UK. And the fear indexes, the red one, and the migration-related policy uncertainty index is the blue one. A couple things stand out. There's been an upward drift in both measures since the mid-2000s, roughly in line with the increased immigration flows into the United Kingdom. And then there's been an enormous spike in the fourth quarter of 2015. So that this particular chart was made with data through November, through the end of November, okay? So it doesn't get all of the fourth quarter, but much of it. And then here's Germany. Okay, not a lot happening until recently. And then notice, this is the fourth quarter of 2015. What does the index value of 1,000 mean? Well, everything's normalized here to 100. So it says there's 10 times as much concern or fear about migration-related issues in Germany, as reflected in newspaper coverage, in this, in the last couple months, as there was on average over the sample period as a whole. And you can see in this instance, and you see this also in the United States and in France, I'm not going to show those to you in the interest of time. You can see, and this is not really a deep surprise, when migration fears intensify, policymakers start to say, what should we do? What are we going to do? And it's a controversial issue. People don't agree about what to do or what the consequences of policy decisions will be. So the shock, in this case, the shock coming from the immigrant inflow from North Africa and the Middle East is confronting policymakers with difficult challenges. It's not clear what they should do. It's not clear what the effects of what they will do. That's generating the policy uncertainty. So there's one other point that I think is worth making from these in connection with the migration issue. And that is, it's clear in the case of the migration issue or the Eurozone crises that there were certain events that were happening, like the Greek debt crisis in 2010, for example, or the recent influx of immigrants, that are putting pressure on the policymaking process. And that's generating the uncertainty about policy decisions. But the amount of uncertainty that arises in response to these shocks is itself influenced heavily by the institutional framework that governs policymaking decisions. If you think about what's happened in recent years in the Eurozone, it's very clear. Why should the sovereign debt crisis in Greece, a tiny country, relative to Eurozone GDP, cause such enormous economic turmoil and so much controversy and uncertainty about policy? I think a big part of the answer is that the institutional framework, common currency union, for example, but lack of fiscal integration, lack of banking union, that was sort of a disaster waiting to happen. And I think maybe to a lesser extent, the recent immigration crisis is showing that the Schengen zone arrangement isn't really well equipped to respond effectively to a shock of this magnitude. Okay, so the point that I'm trying to leave you with there is that yes, there'll be policy uncertainty in response to unforeseen shocks, but how much policy uncertainty depends very much on the institutional setting that's in place in advance of the shock. Okay, very quickly, how do we assess the effects of economic policy uncertainty? We do it in a couple ways. First, we take the 12 countries for which we have these indices, and we basically put them in standard macroeconomic time series models, and we ask whether shocks in those models identified in a statistical manner seem to have some effect, or really seem to be followed by, would be a better way to say it, deteriorations in economic performance. And that's basically what we find. And I think the word I like to use to summarize this evidence is the following. Shocks, unanticipated increases in the amount of policy uncertainty in the environment foreshadow deteriorations in economic performance as measured by investment rates, employment growth, and output. And I use the word foreshadow because it doesn't imply causality. It might be a causal effect, but it could be something else. It could be something else bad happening at the same time as the uncertainty rises that is not fully captured by our statistical model. Okay, but nonetheless, our work and work by others shows that these indices are capturing information that tells us a little bit about the future that's not captured by other measures. Now, in the micro data, we can do much better in a causal sense, and I'll just give you a sense of the flavor of how we do that. Here are, looking across selected industries in the United States, the fraction of revenues that derive from sales to the federal government. So, start up here with guided missiles and space vehicles. If you're a firm in that industry, on average, 78% of your revenues derives from direct sales to the U.S. federal government. I think you're a bit worried, where's the other 22% going? Hopefully it's going to our allies. And then health services, 44%, and so on down the line. Heavy construction, 9%. Now, this is really interesting to an economic researcher because now I can do the following. This is basically what we do. Suppose there's an increase in uncertainty about policy, in particular how much the government's going to spend. It stands to reason that that uncertainty, if it matters at all, is going to have a bigger effect on industries that are heavily dependent on government spending. And similarly, an industry that's heavily regulated, like healthcare in the United States or the financial services sector, is going to be more sensitive to regulatory uncertainty. That's the basic approach that we take. And when we take that approach, we do indeed find that when policy uncertainty rises in the United States, you see bigger responses on several dimensions by firms that are in industries that are heavily exposed to policy uncertainty. In particular, we find bigger increases in stock price volatility in, say, health services and guided missiles and space vehicles when policy uncertainty goes up according to our measure than you do in some industry that only sells 5% of its output to the federal government. You also see bigger declines in firm-level investment rates, bigger declines in employment growth rates. So that's the nature of the evidence that suggests that policy uncertainty is having causal effects. It's not just this foreshadowing, but it has causal effects. Okay, so let me wrap up. Here's the conclusions that I think are worth taking away, or some of them from this discussion. First, our measures suggest very strongly that policy uncertainty fluctuates over time. And it fluctuates in response to those three different categories of events that I talked about. The 9/11 type event, the economic shock type event like the failure of Lehman Brothers, and self-inflicted policy wounds like the debt ceiling crisis. And the point I tried to stress in the discussion of immigration policy, the institutional setting that governs policy making has a big effect on whether these unforeseen shocks lead to a little bit of uncertainty or a lot of uncertainty. There's some econometric evidence that, other things equal, policy-related uncertainty is harmful to economic performance. And then last, I hope you got some sense from this, that the basic approach here of using text sources like newspapers to try to take a squishy concept like policy uncertainty, make it a little more systematic, and then evaluate its effects. That's a powerful research technique that can be applied to many different questions. All right, thanks very much.
To the other side. Thank you very much, Professor Stephen Davis, for this presentation. Now we'll bring up, yes, let's move it closer. It's nice to be close when you discuss. So we'll bring up the gentleman just soon. Just a couple of questions for you, Steve. Now you're talking about, your research shows that it's historically high level of uncertainty both in the US and in Europe in recent years. It's a more global world, it's a more transparent world. According to you, will we ever go back to the lower levels of uncertainty?
Great question. I mean, in the United States at least, things have improved a bit since 2014. The really intense political fights over debt ceilings and tax policies and so on have diminished. But there is an underlying, there are some underlying factors that our research and work by political scientists suggests is pushing up policy uncertainty in the United States and is unlikely to revert anytime soon. And that is, it's well documented among political scientists that polarization among the elected officials, not necessarily the electorate, but the elected officials, has increased dramatically. And one way you can see this is if you go back to the 1960s or the 1970s, you could find many Democrats who were on the right of their party who had views similar to left-leaning Republicans, and vice versa. If you do that same kind of exercise now, and this is based on voting records, you see all the Democrats over here, all the Republicans over here, and almost no overlap in how they vote. So that creates a lot of tension within the policy-making process, tending to lead to extremes on one side or another. That's exactly what played out, in my view, in the Affordable Care Act. Major legislation passed with zero Republican support and almost unanimous Democratic support. That's quite different than the pattern that we've historically had in the United States. Doesn't look like that's going away anytime soon.
So times are changing. Now stability is, to a certain degree, it's very good, and business always say they want stability, but how much stability? I mean, you mentioned Putin. It's officially a democracy still in Russia, but you know, it's more technically. Yeah, how much stability is good?
No, that's a tough question for a couple of reasons. There's always going to be uncertainty. There's no way to eliminate all the uncertainty, and it would be foolish to try. And that's true in the policy-making setting, and it's true in the business setting as well. But what I try to stress is we don't want to needlessly inject additional uncertainty into the economic environment. And several of the examples, I'll talk about the U.S. because that's what I know best. The U.S. has done that several times in recent years. I talked about the debt ceiling crisis. We had the fiscal cliff episode. Let me just say what the fiscal cliff was, and there was a similar battle on a smaller scale in 2010. This is Democrats and Republicans fighting in part about whether some tax cuts that were originally legislated during President George W. Bush's presidency in the early 90s would expire or not. The Republicans wanted to continue them, the Democrats didn't, and they disagreed over whether to continue them, and if so, for which taxpayers. Well, what happened is by the time we got to the end of 2012, they still hadn't decided what the tax rates would be for 2013. And they even waited until the wee hours of 2013. So if you're a business person, or if you're a household, or even if you're in a government agency and you're trying to plan for your budget, you have no idea what your taxes will be, what your revenue stream will be. That kind of uncertainty has very little to go for it. I mean, very little positive to say about it. And I think that kind of uncertainty we should certainly try to minimize. And as I said before, when we think about our institutional arrangements, we need to ask ourselves, are they well designed to respond not just to everyday shocks, but the big shocks that come along from unforeseen directions?
I know you also know a lot about Sweden, and you will take part in the discussion together with the other gentlemen. Let me bring you up, please. Give them a hand. Yes, let me introduce you properly. Ulf Kristersson, who is the Economic Policy Spokesperson of the Moderate Party. We have in the middle there Jan Hassler, who is Professor at IIES and Chairman of the Swedish Fiscal Policy Council, and Max Elger, who is State Secretary to the Minister for Finance, Magdalena Andersson. Warmly welcome to all three of you. I've given you 3 minutes, and well, you can time them actually, because I'm going to time them, to comment on the professor's speech, and then we will together have a discussion. Let's start with you, Max.
Okay, I'll do my best to stay within the 3 minutes. I want to thank you for an interesting presentation. Where I got caught was this policy versus the economy, and I think that one thing that I dislike about the index, but I like about the presentation, is that to me this substantial difference between 9/11, which is an exogenous event that has to be handled, and the fiscal cliff, which is a purely endogenous crisis that the political system generates. So, I mean, ideally you would want to eliminate the latter, you would want to eliminate the previous either, but you can, I mean, that's exogenous, so it's much harder. Would there be any possibility to find an index that would cause or catch the latter policy-induced crisis? That I would find more interesting. Secondly, I mean, we use the media to find policy uncertainty. So implicit, the assumption is that media operates in the same way now as it did 85. Well, I don't believe that. We can scale it by frequency, that is done. But assuming that the tone of voice in media has changed during this period, I mean, we have seen large technical development, popular blog tools, Twitter, smartphones, etc. Maybe the tone of voice has changed of media, such that it's just more erratic or uses uncertainty as a frequent word much more now than it did previously. But then actually we wouldn't capture policy uncertainty, but we would catch medial controversy rather than anything else, which could be an outcome of technical development. Third, I mean, we're all worried about uncertainty, but maybe we should be worried about other things too. I mean, my party and Ulf's party could create certainty. We could create a policy that was yes to everything. There's no medial controversy, there is complete predictability. Policy is, however, not sustainable. we would end up in a Greek situation within a few years, 1 or 2, 3, maybe 4. During which time everybody would be happy, media would cover the Winter Olympics and stuff, and then we would have a crisis eventually. So maybe it's not only policy uncertainty that we should be worried about. Maybe a bit of uncertainty is good if we manage to keep policy sustainable and consistent instead. So I just want to throw another suspect into the game. I think the conclusion here was that we wish to eliminate policy, so politically self-inflicted wounds, so to speak, where the political system just creates crisis for no evident purpose for society. I totally agree. I think that the American situation with wider polarization is so self-evident in the fiscal cliff and budget ceiling. We in Sweden had a similar situation last year when the national budget was rejected and we got another budget. That was policy uncertainty, I can show. And I do believe that what you described with the American situation, where there was more common ground between the parties and a sort of larger effort to cooperate, would also be, in the Swedish context, something worth striving for. So I think we're in a bit of a similar setting, and at least my conclusions are very close to yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Max. You throw a couple of the suspects into this game. You talk about media, you talk about like big shots that you can't really control. If I will bring you back to politics, which is your job, I can just mention the difference from last year. The debt ceiling, you were all agreed about the debt ceiling, now it's kind of gone. The krona for krona, krone for krone, well, that kind of policy. It was very highly loved by every politician last year. It's not there anymore. Isn't this a kind of uncertainty that the professor is talking about that you should not induce to? This is not the big kind of uncertainty, but it's the kind of policy inducement that he was talking about.
Well, first of all, we have no debt ceiling, thankfully. But the expenditure ceiling, it's certainly not gone, absolutely by no means, and we're currently...
But it's not as respected as it was last year.
It's binary, either it's respected or it's not, and it is respected. So I don't agree. When it comes to the crown for crown policy, I mean, we did present an extraordinary budget in this autumn, where we gave the municipalities about 10 billion crowns to go about with their business. That was not, I mean, that was financed by loaning money, and it was done in great unanimity across the political spectrum, and I thought that was a perfect policy response to the situation that we're in, where the municipalities do find several challenges to operate with a quickly growing population. So I think I wouldn't describe the situation quite as you did. On the contrary, the fiscal policy is there and it's highly respected, and I think at least my is strongly committed to...
That's your job to say like that, because you're the budget boss of the government. Ulf, please.
Well, thanks. First, simply to state the obvious, this is pretty far away from our field of expertise, just to say that first. But nevertheless, I'm pretty impressed by this fascinating series of data. I have to admit that. Three very brief reflections. First, on the title, I mean, politics versus the economy. I think it's a good thing that you actually state that, because it is different logics, different ethos. We have different purposes normally. We share the same reality very often, but we have different purposes, you have to respect that, and thereby it's not to say that when politics creates uncertainty, it doesn't have to be a bad thing. It might be the purpose of politics, obviously. But also, just to interfere in your discussion here, I want to take the political part of it. But we have also actually ended up in the conclusion that sometimes you need actually economic restrictions on the political ambitions, because we sometimes, when we are at our best, we distrust our own profession, so to speak. We realize there are temptations that we need economy to actually restrict. My second reflection is this actually ends up to some degree in some humbleness, I would say. Politics sometimes, and the lack of politics sometimes, ends up in very big consequences for the rest of society. We should actually think about that sometimes. When we do make decisions, and when we fail to make decisions, this actually results in enormous consequences for people outside our voting assemblies. And my third remark would be a more current one. Take two very obvious Swedish kind of issues. The first one is the one you mentioned, the migration crisis. That is one of the realities of today, and that obviously creates a lot of uncertainty. Some people like it, some people hate it, in terms of Swedish future labor market policies, housing policies, and I think the realization that there will be changes made, either policy changes or reality changes. Some people fear the first thing, and others fear the second. But this is huge change going on. And the second one is even more local Swedish, and that is what we talk about, the kind of social welfare businesses, policies regulating what private businesses might do and might not do in terms of providing social and welfare services. And that is kind of one very good example of how politics can create you can create the possibility for emerging markets, so to speak, but you can also create enormous uncertainty for business people, stopping them to invest, for example. And that ends up in my conclusion. You have to decide whether you prefer a very slowly adapting policy process, a kind of very pragmatic approach, very incremental approach, or if you prefer the more kind of oddly Swedish model, dramatic U-turns. We stick to one way and then we dramatically change another way. That is a Swedish habit. I'm not that sure it's a very good habit. But we're seeing this otherwise very pragmatic countries seem to have dramatic U-turns in politics. I think we should change that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ulf. Talking about the dramatic U-turns, you made one yourself just a couple of weeks ago concerning your migration policy.
I'm sticking to the Swedish model.
It's true, but it also creates a lot of uncertainty for us as a voter.
Well, I think we have this, sometimes we stick to instead of slowly adapting to new realities, saying, well, we have this situation, I like this, basically I like this, now the problem looks like this, we have to adapt. Instead we seem to stick very firmly to ideology or to not realizing, not admitting there is a new problem increasing, and suddenly we seem to be very agree on dramatic changes. I wouldn't say this is always a bad thing. Our best common example is normally the pension reform in Sweden. We did stick to one system, and suddenly we realized this is not working anymore, and then we changed it dramatically. We're normally pretty proud of being capable of doing that. I'm not sure this is a good way of running politics, basically. I think we have another kind of part of politics in Sweden, which is pretty pragmatic, and we normally are, sometimes in contrast, at least to my reading about American politics, we are sometimes actually capable of sitting down, talking politely to each other, actually saying hello to each other, and then finding solutions. And I would say that I prefer the latter one.
So it's better to actually incrementally change a little bit than doing the kind of U-turn?
Well, if I have to choose between them, I would say the latter, yes.
Can I pick up on one thing that Ulf said in the early part of his remarks that I think is quite important? I didn't have time to talk about it, but I won't use your exact words, but you said, look, sometimes it's advantageous to essentially tie the hands of policymakers. So let me give you an historical example where I think that has played out in a very important way. If you go back to the last time we had a global financial crisis, the 1930s, what was part of the policy reaction in the United States? It's a Smoot-Hawley tariff. Tremendous increases in tariff barriers on imports. Other countries retaliated. We had this collapse in global trade, 2008, 2009. And it's worth asking why it didn't happen. And I think a big part of the reason why it didn't happen, because these protectionist impulses were still there, they still got noise in the United States and elsewhere, is because in the post-World War II era, we had the GATT, the WTO, and this diffusion of multilateral and bilateral trade agreements that made it much, much harder for policymakers to respond in a knee-jerk populist fashion, at least with respect to trade policy. And so we essentially saw nothing like the experience of the 1930s. That, to my mind, is an example of how essentially tying your hands in advance through trade policy agreements in this case can actually lead to better policy outcomes and less uncertainty in the wake of a big shock like a financial crisis.
So tying the hands of politicians might be a good thing. We will pick up on this in just a minute. John, well, welcome.
Thanks. I think this measure of uncertainty is very interesting, and it certainly says something. It's correlated with other measures, but it certainly says something more, and in particular about firms' value and behavior, firms that are more exposed to regulation and government purchases and so on. So it's certainly an interesting and new measure. And you also clearly document that this has impact for variations in investments, employment, and so on. So it's important for the economic development. And I guess that the likely mechanism here is that if uncertainty goes up, there is a strong tendency to wait and see what happens. And so you wait in taking big investments and so on. And this is a mechanism that's fairly well known. I wrote about it in my thesis 20 years ago, and which was called variations in uncertainty and cause variations in the demand. And that brings me to the next point, that we know pretty well, and you provide strong evidence in that direction, that increases in uncertainty creates temporary increases, reductions in investments. How permanent these are, and whether a permanently higher uncertainty leads to permanently worse outcomes, that we know relatively little about. I think that's true, but we know much less about it. And in a sense, that's a more important issue. I'm sure that stable rules, predictable policy, little uncertainty and so on is good, but exactly how much we don't really know. And we would like to know that, but still it's a bit low there. And probably fiscal policy, the best fiscal policy would be so boring, so journalists never write about it. Again, that kind of, you wouldn't like that probably. So you would create something that makes it worthwhile to write about it. And this creates a bit of uncertainty. And you were all talking about whether we should minimize uncertainty, and I guess we agree that we should perhaps not aim for that. I remember an interview with General Gaddafi, if you don't remember him. That's fortunately gone now. But he said in the interview that I despise Western democracy because 51% can decide over 49. And this is immoral and it creates a lot of uncertainty. And the journalist asks, so how do you do it in Libya? We all agree. So it's something intrinsic in democracy that there has to be some consequences of changes in political priorities. You could say, of course, that it's good to have plans. So there should be, and it's good to have rules, sure. I think it's very important to have transparency. And there, monetary policy is a good example, I think, where we much more now know what drives monetary policy. And this, I think, creates, this transparency implies that you get much less of policy-induced uncertainty. Despite that, your monetary policy uncertainty index was as high now as it was before. But this, of course, because there is much more uncertainties that they have to deal with, exogenous. So I think monetary policy is a success example, and some should be probably taken over there. Fiscal policy and other rules are more difficult. I don't think we can have the same system for fiscal policy as we have for monetary policy. It's so intrinsically political, so delegating it to an independent agency, I don't think it works. But transparency is good. Another way to reduce uncertainty is, of course, to have plans for all contingencies. And to some extent, I think that's good. But also some plans would necessarily have to be kept secret until they are implemented. So they, some contingencies we don't really want to talk about it openly in the political discussion until we really have to. I'm sure you can come up with lots of examples of that. Who should survive, who should be let to go on a ship to Mars if only 10,000 people can go on these things. So some things will have to be kept secret if there are plans for it. And that goes against transparency. You don't want governments to have plans in secret drawers for all contingencies. But I guess we perhaps agree on this, that minimizing uncertainty is not a good thing. But obviously things like the fiscal cliff created a lot of uncertainty that was bad. But also there, I guess the fundamental difference between Sweden and US, and there maybe I go a little bit against Ulf, I think we are, in a sense, we agree much more. There are less disparities in the political spectrum here than it is in the US. So it's not only the system, it is actually the dispersion of views that creates
John, you being the Swedish professor in this, what's it like in Sweden? Would you say that the political uncertainty of the last year, of this fall, has actually curbed economic growth?
As I said, I think that's very difficult to say. I would say that that's not my main word. So I said that quite explicitly during the problematic parliamentary situation we had last year, that I think we are strong enough actually to be able to take the uncertainty that came out of that. And I would say that I think that the political system handled it fairly well. So these are not my main concerns about the Swedish economy, that we create a lot of policy uncertainty. Now, of course, I would like to see from the government a little bit more long-run plan, but of course I also understand that currently it's a lot about taking care about the absolute situation.
Max, he's quite happy with how you handled the situation, but now he wants a more long-term plan. Professor, what do you say?
Well, I also realized that he doesn't want us to plan for all contingencies, or not publicly so.
He wants you to live a bit of uncertainty, yeah.
Not in the drawer either.
And not emigrate to Mars. I didn't quite get that part. Well, I think in the current situation, what is true is that there is real uncertainty. I mean, as opposed to policy uncertainty. I mean,
which is not real uncertainty?
Well, the real exogenous uncertainty then. There is currently a large uncertainty as to how many people will choose to come to Sweden in the coming years. I mean, we have together, in fact, created some policy responses to that. I think that's very positive. But the outcome of that is technically very unclear. We just don't know what numbers of people we're looking at, which is a primary driver of the cost side of public finances. So there is uncertainty. Making very elaborate plans with that uncertainty in the very long term. I'm not convinced that that would be informative even. However, I do think that what has been mustered thus far with regard to policy responses has been adequate, and I sort of infer from that the political parties are ready to act should it be needed, even if further action is needed, which we, as stated, don't know. That there's a clear data uncertainty here.
Yeah, let me jump in, and I didn't get a chance to address some of Max's earlier comments, some of which I agree with, and some of which I think about it in a different way. So, you stressed, one of the things I stressed is that there are many types of events that are driving the movements in the index. And you said, well, maybe we ought to have an index that separates them out. I don't think about it that way, and I'll tell you why. When we measure the national income accounts and we measure real GDP, it's a measurement exercise. And then we ask the question, what are the things that are causing economic growth to fluctuate over time? And that involves statistical and economic modeling on top of the measurement effort. The same is true here. The first stage of a scientific research enterprise is to measure the thing you're interested in. Then you start to talk about the different things that move it around. So that's the sense in which I look at that issue a bit differently than you. You also raised another very important issue that I just skipped over because I was afraid of exceeding my time, and I know media's really tough about that. This question of, well, are newspapers really reliable? Okay, there's a lot of effort in our work to address just that question. I think one of the most convincing exercises we do in that regard is to say, okay, what do newspapers do? They're basically written by educated laypersons for average Joes. Average person. That's, I don't know if the average Joe, not a well understood expression for average persons. So, okay, and they're swayed by politics, you know, and so on. What we did is we went to something called the Beige Book, which is a document that's been put out in the same form by the U.S. Federal Reserve System, the Monetary Policy Authority in the United States, every 6 weeks. And it's a very different document. It's written by experts, economists throughout the Federal Reserve System and the 12 regional banks, for experts, namely the people who are making policy decisions. And you know, they're not, you know, they're supposed to be apolitical. I think they largely are. And that source also shows the same big increase in policy uncertainty in the period after 2007. In fact, it's even a bigger increase in that measure, where it's experts writing for other experts. So that's an example. We've done other things like that that give me some confidence, because I think the concern you raised is exactly the one we had. Well, does this really measure what we want? And the audit, the human audit, doesn't address that question. All the human audit does is say, is the computer accurately reflecting what's in the article? And so then we have to look to other exercises to say, okay, do newspaper articles accurately reflect what's going on? And the evidence that we find suggests that it does.
But isn't the counterexample there the fact that the monetary policy uncertainty index has stayed constant? Why? I mean, you don't really take that as evidence that policy-induced uncertainty from the Fed has remained constant. I would say that it's kind of obvious that it's come down.
Oh, well, there's two. Okay, that's
given the big things that have happened.
I think here's my interpretation of that. There has been uncertainty about monetary policy and a lot of discussion, but mainly among professional economists. Things about QE programs. Newspapers don't write about that very much. What they write about is inflation and uncertainty about inflation. And we have lots of hard evidence that, with the exception of a brief period in late 2008, early 2009, where you do see some slight evidence in financial markets that inflationary expectations were becoming less anchored in the United States. After that brief period, the Fed, according to looking at Fed futures type measures, if you look at surveys of professional forecasters, they all indicate the Fed did quite a good job of maintaining anchored expectations regarding inflation. And that's what gets covered in the newspapers. So I actually think the fact that the policy uncertainty for monetary authorities, as reflected in the newspapers, did not go up that much, is a consequence of successful policy, relative especially to fiscal policy. Now, I just want to tell one more anecdote here. It's a funny story. There's one really big departure between the newspapers and the Fed's beige books. And that is, in the beige books, over 35 years, they only talked about monetary policy one time. Okay? Whereas the newspapers talking about it all the time. So there is that kind of amusing bias in the Fed's own measures.
May I add on just one foreign perspective to the other ones? My family, we spent one full year in Beijing a few years ago, or quite some years ago, and while my wife was working, I was back home. I was waiting for my Chinese teacher to arrive to our apartment. And this was at the end of the first Obama campaign for presidency. I was watching the final debates, and she came in and realized what I was watching, obviously. And then she asked me, who's going to win? Well, I said, well, we won't know for a few days, you know. And suddenly she realized, I didn't know either. Nobody knows who's actually becoming the US president. How can you accept that kind of uncertainty? One of the world's most powerful countries. She thought it was a very unserious kind of approach.
It's not the example of China. Now, you were talking about monetary policy here. We're waiting for the anything at the moment. Max, what would you say about the difference between monetary policy uncertainty and fiscal policy uncertainty?
I would say by nature there should be much more uncertainty in fiscal policy because it's a multi-dimensional object, whereas monetary policy is quite focused on interest rate.
So it's easy for the people that take expansion.
Well, I would see that the mechanism by which we try to reduce uncertainty in monetary policy, much like John said, may not be apt for the fiscal policy side because, I mean, I think in the national budget we have some like 1,200 or something different small rows that we control. That's far more than one interest rate. That's just an example. But I think that the mechanism that have been created to induce more certainty or transparency rather with regard to monetary policy are probably not quite applicable when it comes to fiscal policy.
But John, you said you've seen more uncertainty that this index shows concerning the monetary policy.
Well, regarding monetary policy, I think it's a success actually, the transformation that we've seen over the years. But the key fact is that it's been much more difficult to pursue monetary policy during the financial crisis. And despite that, we haven't seen a big rise in monetary policy uncertainty. And that reflects the success, I think. When it comes to fiscal policy, of course, I mean, I agree with Max. But there are, of course, things that can be done in order to increase, to reduce uncertainty and increase transparency. And the fiscal framework that we have had now for some decades in Sweden is, I think, a very good way of, you know, inducing some stability, some norms, some rules that everyone agrees to follow, and so on. They are self-imposed, but they are very important, and in particular for uncertainty.
So would you say that we need to reform the system to reduce the uncertainty more, or?
Well, I mean, there are some problems with the current framework, yes, but it's been, in general, it's been good. But there are certainly some issues that everyone knows that we are discussing now, and it can be better. But in general, I think things like that are important to provide some sort of guidance where we are going in the longer run, where we aim with the economy. I mean, also there it runs a little bit with recent developments in monetary policy, where the central banks around the world are more and more giving more forward guidance, telling what they're going to do in the longer run. So there, maybe there actually fiscal policy has been a little bit ahead of monetary policy.
So in general, good. Ulf, what do you think? Is it time to reform the system to reduce the uncertainty?
Well, to some extent, as you know, we are in the middle of a process where we actually are really looking at the framework, obviously, at least parts of the framework, the surplus target, which is one pretty kind of long-sighted part of it. I think that's a good idea, basically. I think even though it's kind of self-imposed, I think it creates long-term stability. People can foresee what politics actually could do. And I think this is, I won't accuse Max of all the crimes you actually suggested, not today at least. I'll find other days for that. But I would say though that there's a good reason for politics to realize and to think about the fact that politics has a tendency of short-sightedness. There is always a kind of a temptation to do things now, and that actually normally, I mean, there is obviously a risk for kind of a tax and spend tradition, or even worse, not tax but spend tradition as well.
Yeah.
Well, at least in the long term, it creates similar problems. And to handle that, I think all these restrictions which we actually make up in kind of peacetime, they are very useful when things is heating up.
Now, you both said that a bit of uncertainty still is good in politics and policy-wise. Max, what could you as a policymaker do to reduce uncertainty, even if you leave a little bit of uncertainty still there?
Well, to which extent this is good? Well, certainly to the extent that Ulf is pointing out, the democratic process does induce uncertainty. We like that. So that's good. I think the reduction in uncertainty that has been done thus far is obviously the fiscal policy framework to which we are totally committed and are, as are many parties in the Parliament. To move even further to reduce uncertainty, I'm not aware of any such concrete initiative currently. I think that what we're doing in the budget process discussion is not necessarily reducing uncertainty, but sort of tweaking the system to a more functional place. So I don't perceive that per se as an initiative to reduce uncertainty.
Now, you all seem pretty happy with this kind of level of uncertainty that we do have in the policy system. We don't have any business leader on the podium today, and I know what they're saying. They're not really happy with what they call the kind of unstable political situation.
I mean, stability has a kind of a certain value in Swedish politics. Stability, you know, if you remember the old TV news with the former prime minister, stability in China. I would say we don't like that stability. As long as politics is about the future, not only about crisis management, we do appreciate a certain amount of instability, because politics is about what to do in the future. Different views are kind of competing on what to do in the future, and obviously that creates uncertainty and instability. I think that's on purpose.
But is it possible to have stable rules and regulations so the business life knows how to?
There's always a trade-off, of course.
Yeah, I think this discussion draws out the complexity of these issues about the advantages and the disadvantages of rules that promote stability. And I think everybody seems to be in line with the view that it would be a mistake to try to impose complete predictability. So the question is, where's the balance? I gave you an example of trade policy agreements as an example where I think we have used the institutional environment in the global economy to induce more stability in trade policy decisions, and that's had positive effects in my view. But certainly there are situations in which a misguided attempt to secure complete stability can either lead to very bad policies, or in non-democratic societies, what happens? Well, you may not have elections, but you're much more likely to have revolutions. So you may just be storing up all the uncertainty and concentrating it for a very certain time period. So, whereas the prospect of a civil revolution in Sweden or the United States seems rather remote, and that's partly because we have the democratic process that is a relief valve and a source of incremental uncertainty from period to period. And I think that's a good thing.
So one thing that we haven't talked about is kind of micro uncertainty at the micro level, and I think there is some room for substantial improvement in Sweden. So in Sweden, one of the major problems I think is the badly functioning market for housing and the construction of housing. And there, many people, I think, rightly complain about the huge uncertainty involved in getting building permits, understanding zoning laws, differences between different cities, and so on. And there, I think, uncertainty about the outcome of these processes is a real impediment for solving the problem.
So you would think that the market here would use some kind of more stability. Another example, Max, is the healthcare sector, which has been a lot of political uncertainty around the rules and regulations. What do you say about the housing sector and the healthcare sector?
No, I think John has a fair point. It does take a long time to go from the idea to build a big house to actually getting it in place. I think the average time is about 7 years or so. The previous government did do some initiatives to shorten that period. We've carried much of that work onwards, but I do think there is significant room for improvement when it comes to housing. And seeing that it's definitely a challenge for Sweden now that the population has grown very quickly in a very short time period. That issue certainly has to be addressed. Also, I think when we have discussed uncertainty on the macro level rather than anything else, and one shouldn't disregard micro uncertainty. I also think that the mapping between uncertainty and some institutional arrangements is not evident. When I look back at the last year, I mean, it's sort of, we proposed a budget that didn't pass the parliament. We entered into December agreement. We thought that we'd sort of figured out the rules of the game pretty well for the coming 3-4 years. That lasted until, well, November, at which time that agreement was exited from. Not by us, in fact, but by us. But then some.
You have to point that out.
But the thing is that approximately the same period as that agreement was torn to pieces, we also agreed on a migration, sort of the first set of policy responses to migration, which was very unanimous and very unilateral. So I think in the Swedish case, it's hard to see the mapping from formal agreements and emanating certainty or uncertainty. And I do think that the sort of collaborative atmosphere that has emanated in the past few months would be a better foundation for certainty in the future rather than any more or less formal agreement.
Collaborating atmosphere.
That's how I describe it.
I'm not against the collaborating atmosphere, no.
Interesting to hear. Yes,
Let me give an example. And so I'm going to talk about the U.S. It does pertain to housing, but we've had a very different problem than the one that you described that's been foremost in the United States that very much contributed to the severity of the financial crisis, and it was a direct consequence of government policy. So the U.S. government, through a variety of regulations and through the government-sponsored enterprises like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, had encouraged mortgage loans to lower income people with weak credit and very low down payments. And the government did that in a variety of ways, but principally by being willing to guarantee those mortgage loans. And so what's a low down payment? As low as 3% down. So you think about, if you have millions of people with mortgage loans, where they have very little equity stake in the home, and then there's a major decline in real estate prices, which there was in the United States, you suddenly have millions of people whose mortgage is underwater, and that creates a lot of uncertainty. That was another example of, in the U.S. setting, how policy decisions, and this was something that had been supported by both Republicans and Democrats. This was also a collaborative effort, but in that case it was a collaboration in the wrong direction. And it very much set the stage, not for the fact that the financial crisis happened perhaps, but how severe the consequences were. And it also created extra uncertainty along the way. So I do think that these kind of under the radar screen micro policies can have a profound effect on either improving the situation in the economy, both with respect to kind of whether it's a good or bad policy, but also with respect to the uncertainty that follows on shocks.
So it's time to invite you into the discussion, please.
Thank you. I'm Thomas Gears, a former German actually. But I was going to ask a question to Professor Davis, whether it is possible, since we are speaking about policy uncertainty curbing economic growth, to measure, shall we say, long-term political uncertainty that is not reflected in the media, that is structural political uncertainty, if the term is applicable or not a contradiction in terms per se. For example, long-term market or labor market regulations that the newspapers do not write about, or political systems or political decision structure systems that create continuous uncertainty on an ad hoc basis. But we do write about the phenomena, but not the structures themselves. Is it possible to measure them, and then also it is possible to measure them also to measure whether they do curb economic activity or not?
Right. Great question. It's possible, but it's hard. Let me give you two ways in which make some headway. First, there are in the United States, and I presume in Sweden as well, parts of the government that are charged with evaluating the sustainability of future tax and spending policies. And in the United States, at least, we have a problem that the taxes that we have in place and promise to levy people on people in the future are not high enough to meet the obligations that we've also put in place. So it's over some long period of time, not in the next 5 years, probably not even the next 10 years, but over the long period of time, some adjustments will have to be made, either in terms of tax policy, spending policy, or we're just going to have to get a much more rapid economic growth than we anticipated. So it's possible to do that kind of exercise. And then one of the standard ways that economists measure uncertainty in financial markets is they use option prices. Okay, so some of you may be familiar with the VIX. The VIX is essentially a measure of implied stock market volatility. It's the volatility implied by the prices of options that are traded in the market. Now, at least that's how the VIX index is constructed. But the VIX index there's a 30-day version, maybe a 90-day version. It doesn't go out very far. However, there is proprietary trading in options on equity market outcomes as far as 10 years out. And Goldman Sachs has done some very interesting work where they say, okay, let's try to construct an option implied uncertainty measure, not just for the next 1 year, 2 years, and so on, but all the way out to 10 years. And they put out a few newsletters where they do just that, and out to 10 years, because they have proprietary data all the way out. So that data is not available to me, but you can see what they say, and they then look at the relationship between our movements in our index and movements in their option applied uncertainty measures. And the interesting thing there is the longer out you look, the more extra correlation there appears to be with our newspaper-based measure, suggesting that some of these longer-term concerns about fiscal matters in particular are probably feeding into our newspaper index. But it's a very challenging issue that you're raising, and I don't think we have any great tools to address it.
But it would be interesting to see the answer to that.
Yes.
Yes, please.
I have a question for Professor David. When you showed your chart over your view, it looks very much like a financial stress index. And that is not really surprising, really, because when there is a lot of financial stress in the economy, then there is a lot of uncertainty for firms, households, policymakers, and even politicians. But the policy, the monetary policy, has stayed very constant, as also John has pointed out. This might be due to the choice that you have made of the words for picking up monetary policy. Because it's exactly during the financial crisis that you see the uncertainty that your index picks up. And that is a period of great monetary policy uncertainty and a lot of actions from many central banks that must reflect in the index.
Right.
So this also brings me to something else, my second point. If you don't have, good words that pick up the uncertainty in monetary policy, the health and taxes words might actually be picking up that, but indirectly. Because when you have a lot of financial stress, then of course taxes and health becomes very important. But it's not really uncertainty around those issues. They are picking up something else. So how do you choose your words? And what robust checks you make?
So is it a question of wordings here? Steve?
Yeah, so I think I understand the question. There's 2 points there. Let me take them in turn. On the first point, is this just really a financial distress index? And I don't fully agree with you, and I'll tell you why. There certainly are episodes in the 2008-2009 period would be a prime example where financial distress measures and financial uncertainty measures in our index spike at the same time. But there are also other episodes in which they move quite differently. And in particular, if you look at the kinds of financial uncertainty measure that I referred to earlier, the VIX, it basically comes down very sharply after 2009, whereas the policy uncertainty index stays high. Second, I can go into the details of the statistical work, But in the statistical work we do, both the macro time series approach and the firm level approach, we include measures like the VIX and monetary policy measures as control variables in our statistical model. And so the results that I told you about, and I think the most powerful results are the firm level, those are results where I have controlled for the standard measures of financial uncertainty. And I'm still finding these effects. Moreover, when I look at the category-specific versions of my policy uncertainty index, like the healthcare policy uncertainty index, that has extra explanatory power in the firm-level regression models for firms in the healthcare sector. And it's very hard to explain that as a financial distress proxy because it's measuring healthcare-related terms, and the impact in statistical analysis is showing up on healthcare firms and not other firms like financial firms. But these are the kinds of details that we have to worry about in the statistical analysis to address the issue that you're raising. Now, your second point was basically, well, how do I choose and evaluate the appropriateness of the terms in my policy term set? And I gave some brief discussion of that in my remarks. We have, I'll give a little bit more, and I want to give you a flavor of how intensive this exercise was. So every one of my auditors, and I said we had about 20 that we used over this time period, they go through a training process. Not all of them survive the training process because they just do a lousy job of coding. About 80 to 90% make it through the training process, if not on the first try, the second try, or the third try. Part of the training process is there's a 65-page guidebook that they have to learn and apply when they do the audit. And then over a 2-year period, I met with these audit teams every week or two. And we would discuss the articles that they found hard to code. We also did something else to ensure the quality of this process, and the auditors knew this. About 25% of the articles were assigned to 2 auditors, randomly. And they didn't know who was doing another article. So then, one of the things we did in this meeting is we discussed disagreement cases. And, here's Jill, she comes in, I've read what she's done, and I see, she's really nailed it, and here's John. John's really screwed it up, he was watching a football game or something when he should have been reading the article. And I say, John, can you explain to me why you coded the article this way? And then I asked Jill. And so they very quickly learn if they screw up, it's going to be kind of embarrassing. There's a bunch of 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds, and they're all explaining to each other what they're doing. So there's a lot of effort that goes into trying to maintain the quality of the audit process. And then the final step is, okay, I have my human beings who coded these thousands of articles, who've made judgments, and hopefully well-informed ones, and I try to explain why I think they're well-informed. I'm going to evaluate my terms that I chose. So the term Federal Reserve made it into that term set, that P term set, because it maximized the fit of the computer decisions relative to what the human beings had decided. Now again, is it perfect? No, but that's the kind of things we do.
Not perfect, but a lot of work behind it. It's time for us to wrap up this decision. Now, Steve, you have a presidential election coming up next year in the U.S. What do you think that will do to your index?
Well, it depends very much on whether the Republicans manage to put forth a sensible candidate, which is in some doubt at the moment. There's clear evidence in our time series that when there's no incumbent running for the presidency, the index values tend to be high. You saw that with the first election of Bill Clinton, the first election of George Bush. It's true in the Obama election too, but there was so much else happening at the same time that it doesn't really stand out. So I suspect if, I'll reveal my own views, God forbid, Trump becomes the Republican nominee and the race is at all close between him and Hillary Clinton, there will be a great deal of uncertainty because there will be a lot of doubt among some of the electorate, certainly among the business community, and I presume around the world as to what might happen under a Trump presidency. So basically, if the Republicans put forth a candidate like that, I think there'll be a lot of uncertainty showing up on our end.
Our former Secretary of State called Bills. He wrote on Twitter, if environment that you have shown here from both the biggest parties. Thank you very much,